So you all have to pledge yourself to introducing yourself to everyone else in this room at some point in this event. It's really important. I believe in that. I believe in that. So my name is Jeffrey Tucker, and I'm the I'm the founder and president of the Brownstone Institute. Brownstone is dedicated to an emancipationist agenda, which is to free us from the hell of the last 20 minutes and to perhaps bring together some really important people to lay out, to provide a light for rebuilding after the catastrophe that we've all lived through. I haven't spoken in too many places over the last couple of years, but every time I have, I've welcomed everybody and congratulated people. You are a survivor, right? I mean, we all feel like survivors after everything we've been through. And we all have our own stories of trauma that we've been through, the brutalization, and it's not just us in this room, right? It pertains to millions of people, billions of people all over the world. What we've been put through for the sake of this virus mitigation is beyond anything probably that you thought you would experience in your lifetime. Certainly that's true for me. I've always just been a very happy, optimistic techno-utopian, you know, like a 19th century Whig, you know, late 19th century. Oh, we have now what we need to build civilization. Things can only get better. We know what human rights are. We know what freedom is. We know the merits of peace. We've got this. We're leaving the past behind. We know what works. Let's just do more of that, and then everything will be okay. That's what the old 19th century liberals believed. And then what happened to them was World War I. And it shattered their hopes and dreams and blew up the expectation for progress. And we realized for the first time the kind of brutality that human beings are capable of inflicting on each other. And it demoralized people all over the world and spread nihilism and despair, and it was tragic. Well, a century later, we've experienced our own form of that, I think, in my own life. To go from a Whig-style, techno-utopian with endless books, about the happiness and joys of life, and to see the lights go out gradually and then kind of all at once, and for it to last so long, has shifted my worldview, and I'm guessing it's changed your minds about a lot of things too. I doubt very seriously any one of us in this room is the same kind of person you were 2 years ago, because we've learned terrible things we didn't know were possible. And we all have our own stories about those dark days in mid-March 2020. I remember so well. And by the way, I've been writing about pandemic policy for 15 years, right? I knew that these kinds of things were possible, the lockdowns. I knew that they had the quarantine power, and they could use it, and they could do things like shut down your businesses and divide the population and everything else. March 8th was the day I realized that it was going to happen, and that was the day that the South by Southwest conference in Austin, Texas was canceled by the mayor. And I thought, oh, we got 10 years of lawsuits here. You can't just cancel a conference for 250,000 people because that's what you want, because you think that that controls a virus. This is an outrage. But you know what? There was no outrage. It was shocking to me. I wrote an article about this. And honestly, I was one of the very few. Why? Where was the outrage? We've all been asking this question, what happened? My only feeling about this is that intellectually and culturally and socially and politically, something had gone very wrong in this country long before the lockdowns. We lost a consensus for liberal values. Some reason, I was under the impression that despite some weird outliers, most of whom live in academia, there was a general consensus in favor of things like equality, freedom of association, freedom to travel. The aspiration for universal human uplift was something that we all shared, regardless of your politics. Suddenly we woke up one day, and it seemed as if that consensus was gone under the pretext of controlling the invisible enemy, without any evidence that any of these measures could possibly actually achieve the aim, much less achieve the aim in a cost-minimizing way. Why was there no real thought given to the damage that could be caused? I don't know. I think we're going to be asking this question for a very long time. The premonition that something was terrible about to take place happened for me on February 27th. That was the New York Times podcast where Donald J. Did you hear that? February 27th. Am I the only one who listens to this? I used to listen to it. I don't anymore. February 27th, Donald J. McNeil, the lead virus reporter, came in and told Michael Barbaro, whom I consider to be a friend, that this disease was going to kill, I don't forget his numbers, they were in like 4 to 6 million people. You're going to have lots of your friends are going to be dropping dead. No talk about the demographics, no talk about, if you think that virology and public health, much less cell biology, didn't even exist for this guy. He was spreading panic. And I always thought of the New York Times as a venue that was not in favor of disease panic. I thought there was a kind of a responsible news outlet, that cared and respected science. That day, not so much. And I turned off the radio and I thought, either Barbaro was trolled by a crazy man, or there's something else brewing here. The very next day, he had an op-ed in the New York Times called, true story, called, "To take on the coronavirus, go medieval on it." Go medieval? We really want to go medieval on something? Why are we suddenly celebrating medieval-style policies and society? What is going on here? And if you read that article, he said we need to lock people in their cities, block them from traveling, trap them in their disease-ridden homes. It was the most ghastly article, and reject everything we've learned over the last 100 years about virus mitigation. Reject all that in favor of medievalism. And so sure enough, that's what we did. Gradually, we segregated society. Essential, unessential, elective surgeries, non-elective surgeries. You couldn't go to the dentist. Talk about medieval, right? No dentistry. They really went all medieval. Astonishing levels of state power. I don't need to rehearse it for you, but you know what happened. They closed the schools out of panic. Children attacked with them. Suddenly, homeschooling, which, for 30 years has existed, under a legal cloud where you feel like you're breaking bad just by educating your kid at home, suddenly became mandatory for everybody. What are we doing? If you look at the data on labor force participation during that period, you know who left the workforce, right? It was women. I mean, moms. They left their jobs to stay home, take care of their kids. Millions of whom never went back to work again. Where's the outrage? Minorities have been hit so fundamentally. And then, what time is it? And then, we instituted universal policies that severely divided the ruling classes from the working classes. Amazing. And without any consciousness that this was happening. Who should we assign the burden of herd immunity to? Who's going to take on this pathogen? We know it's the working classes. The rest of us clean people, we're going to stay away from that virus. Completely unaware that in the whole history of humanity, we have tried these systems of segregating people based on clean versus unclean, of assigning the burden of pathogens to the lower classes, to the people who don't matter. It's called feudalism, and that's what we did. And I say we, they. And they were so unaware of this. Forget equality, right? What about democracy? What about all these slogans? Freedom? No, none of it matters. Now it's only about disease mitigation. So at any moment in the last 20 months, you could have opened up the New York Times. I'm not a fan anymore. I don't know what's happened to your attitudes toward the New York Times. I used to really like it. Something that's gone very wrong in that paper. You could open up the New York Times at any moment and put in your zip code and find out what you're supposed to do about the cases in your community. You look up your zip code, they go, up, you've got coronavirus cases in your community. What should you do? Do not travel. Don't leave your home. Don't go to any super spreading events. Mostly, you need to get your groceries delivered. Delivered? Delivered by whom? I guess not readers of the New York Times. Because you notice they didn't say, deliver groceries. Have them delivered. You see the class element here, right? I mean, this strange way in which the Zoom class just decided to lord it over everybody else. Wow. Wow. Freedom, equality, rights. Where did they go? They just got thrown out of the window. And then, who could have imagined that after all this time, those very people who bore the biggest burden during the first year of the pandemic would now be told that the immunities that they acquired by virtue of their service to the rest of us and their service to society would now be completely disregarded. They have to choose between getting the jab or losing their jobs. This is what's been going on. And we wonder why there's so much public anger out there, why people are furious. There's no mystery, my friends. We went medieval on the virus, and that has shattered modernity, essential presumptions about what constitutes a civilized life, demoralized people, destroyed people psychologically, shattered families, separated us from friends, all because we decided to treat a pathogen with political means instead of using traditional public health. I'm so proud to be in a room with people who have been great champions of public health, good, traditional, wise, science-based public health principles, and done it at great personal and professional risk and expense. Truly, our times have created great heroes. Brownstone, the Brownstone Institute. I knew, and you did too, in middle of March, especially after the March 16th press conference, when Dr. Birx announced to the whole world our new social system. What was that? This is a new social system in which we must all stay separate from everyone else. That's what she said. This is insanity. No society in the history of the world has ever operated under the principle of radical separation of people from everybody else. She's advocating what amounts to a completely new social system based on a totalitarian enforcement mechanism, and everybody just sat there nodding their heads. Oh, good point. Good point. We'll all just separate. Crazy. Where was the foundations of civilization? Where was the outrage? I'm still asking that question. I don't know. Look, these people are going to be repudiated and their vision along with it. I think they're headed for massive disgrace. All of them. I'm angry. You're angry. That's not the purpose of the Brownstone Institute, though. What we want to do is rekindle what I thought we had, which is respect for human dignity, first and foremost. After 20 months of being told by experts that you are pathogenic, your breath is poison, cover your face, your neighbor is a threat to you, we are nothing. Human beings are not people with dignity, worthy of equality. No, they're disease vectors. Everybody is. And then we dare tell our children the same thing. This is not a worldview that's capable of sustaining a good life or a good civilization. That must be replaced. Replaced by what? By the things we are supposed to have learned over the last 500 years. Every human being is dignified. Everybody deserves opportunity. We seek a social system in which emancipation for everyone is the goal. Choice, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, so the government can't just come and shut down your church. Can you believe this happened? Can you believe it? We rejected all of that. For what reason? So we need to find a new way to build, to love, to respect others. We need to rediscover the essential principles that gave birth to modernity in the first place. And by modernity, I mean from the late Middle Ages on. Okay, well, here's the thing. And I'm about to conclude my little rambling talk here and introduce our speaker. But there have been times in history where great emergencies have taken place, great emergencies. And in those emergencies, there have always been safe refuges, places that preserve learning, that preserve great minds, refuges, safe havens, sanctuaries. I think in particular of the Geneva Institute for Graduate Studies in Switzerland in the interwar period when the Nazis were rising in Vienna and driving out and really shattering and leading to a diaspora of the greatest center of intellectual activity in the world. They had to flee. Where did they go? Fortunately, that graduate school in Geneva was open to them, and they took them in. And my mentor, intellectual mentor, never knew him unfortunately, died in 1973. His name was Ludwig von Mises. And he looked outside of his window in 1934 and saw the Nazi youth parading up and down the streets and knew that something was terrible was happening. He made this dramatic decision to flee Vienna and go to Geneva, where he was protected for 6 years, during which time he wrote one of the great books of the 20th century, later called Human Action. Came out in 1940 in German. It flopped. Translated to English, right? Translated to English, published in 1949, didn't sell well. Finally, when the 1968 edition came out, it became something close to a bestseller, and now is one of the most influential books of the 20th century. But look what had to happen. You had to have Geneva there. He had to make the decision to move. They gave him 6 years to write this 1,000-page treatise. It flopped. It didn't go anywhere. Then he came to the United States. 9 years later, he translates to English. And still, you had to wait another really 20 years for the book to really catch on. That's a long period of time. But look at the results. One of the great thinkers. And he was just one guy. There were thousands of people that were purged. The lesson I take from that, and you know, this is a funny thing about history. You read about the history of tyranny all you want. We always think it's in the past. Oh, that was then. But we've learned. We know now, all of us in this room, something we didn't know before. It's possible. It can happen again. We must prepare. We must have sanctuaries for great minds, for intellectuals, for the principles we believe in, because they can be taken away like that. I didn't know it's possible. We've learned that it is possible. So my friends, the emergency is far from over. We need to start rebuilding for the future. The reason for the word brownstone all relates to the building material that was used most commonly, especially around here, between the years of about 1820 and 1870, before we had steel to build tall buildings. It was a foundational thing in the 19th century when we began to discover the idea of human rights and universalize it and think about progress and really build a good society so that everyone can flourish. Brownstone was an essential building block. It has no grain, so it can be cut this way and cut that way, and it's also sometimes called freestone. And I'm going to give a final tribute to my mother, who came up with the name. God bless her, right? Well, it was funny because I walked into the living room and she sat up and she said, "Jeffrey, I have the name of your institute." And I dreaded it, right? Because I thought, there's no way I can say no to this woman. Ever. She said Brownstone. I thought, oh, you're a genius, you know. It's hard to come up with a name. Anyway, we're here and we're just starting out. We're 100 days old. We've had 3 million page views on the site. 3 million, yeah. And why? It's because these are new times. New times, new friends, new institutions, new ways of thinking. I started by saying you're survivors, you are, but we all have a job to do. We have a mighty job to do. And it's all about the ideas we believe and the aspirations we have for society. They, by whom I mean mostly a ruling class, elite that did this to us, believe that they are the architects of history, the authors of our fate. They are not. We are. I'm not saying we're in charge. I'm saying that individuals and what we believe about ourselves and about our others, that is the historical narrative. We are capable of turning this around. We have to turn it around. We have a moral obligation to turn it around. That obligation is going to require courage. It already has on the part of many of you, all of you. You've been courageous. I believe this battle has just begun. It's just begun. We're in for the long haul. The rebuilding effort with Brownstone is going to take us decades. I don't have a plan as such. We're going to work off our intuitions. We're going to go off our moral, using moral courage, drawing on the best scientists and the best science that we have. We will not be defeated. We're going to rebuild and hopefully bring about a new way of thinking about freedoms and human rights, institutionalize those ways of thinking so we can never take a risk with civilization again. So thank you very much, and let's have a great conference. Thank you. And speaking of great, courageous intellectuals, I want to introduce, and it's such a pleasure, a mentor of mine, a great mentor and a great friend for so long. His name is Donald Boudreaux, and he teaches economics at George Mason University. And wow, watching this man perform over the last 20 months intellectually has been an inspiration. Indefatigable doesn't quite describe it. So I'm very honored to have him on the board of the Brownstone Institute and to be our very first speaker. Donald Boudreaux, my mentor and friend. Thank you.
I am, people say I'm humbled. They use that word too often. I am humbled to be here. I'm honored to be here. I should say Jeff chose wisely to maintain the rousing tenor of today. He chose an economist to speak right after him. So we'll see what I can do. I'm in a room of heroes. That's another word that's used too frequently, but I mean that sincerely. Jeffrey himself, when he was at AIER until earlier this year, he was on the ball right away, understanding the dangers of the reaction to COVID. And he published a lot of great stuff there. The founding of the Brownstone Institute, I believe, is the next great step in attacking this mania that has overtaken humanity. I was on Thursday, just past Thursday, 48 hours ago, I was speaking at Clemson University in South Carolina, and on COVID policy. It was a big lecture, and my host, Brad Thompson, was embarrassed when we walked into the auditorium because he made it clear that I wasn't speaking with a mask on. I just won't do that. I think it beclowns you if you do that. So I didn't have to use a mask. All the students and all the audience were masked. But to have me speak, they had the podium set up, and they had this huge plexiglass thing built around it. And I quickly asked, can you find another podium? and they did. They found a little bitty footstool that we use as a podium. But I wasn't going to stand behind that thing because I would have felt like Adolf Eichmann at Nuremberg. I mean, it was just awful and hideous. So Jeff asked me to speak for just a few moments. I am an economist. About an economist's reaction, at least this economist's reaction to the past 21 months. My background as an economist, my tradition is the old Chicago school, Milton Friedman, the Austrian school, Ludwig von Mises, and F.A. Hayek, who Jeff mentioned, the UCLA school, very market-oriented economists, and that's my background. And for years, for decades, I'm as old as I look, for decades, when policy issues come up, there's a typical response. So some politician or some pundit says, okay, we need to raise the minimum wage. We need to raise tariffs. We need to have occupational licensing. We need to raise capital gains taxes. And good economists say, well, wait a minute, the world's not quite as simple as you think it is. So we economists would point out all the various problems with these policy proposals. I miss those days when those were the things that we were complaining about. So I made a list of 5. There are many more, but I only have only 20 minutes. A list of 5 essential guideposts that economics provides for good public policy. And I want to share those with you. These are in no particular order. But the first is, these are things that should always be kept in mind whenever there's a discussion of public policy, particularly when that discussion is launched by a politician or a pundit proposing some new intervention into private affairs, human commerce or other private affairs. The first is that the world's a lot more complex than the politicians and pundits normally take it to be. And because the world's a lot more complex than people take it to be, the simple solutions that they propose are often off base. Jeffrey and I each worked at different times for an organization called the Foundation for Economic Education. The founder of the Foundation for Economic Education was a man named Leonard Read, and the most famous thing he did, other than found the Foundation for Economic Education, FEE as it's called, is in 1958 write a very famous little monograph, which I'm sure many of you know. It's called I, Pencil. And it explains how an ordinary pencil is the result of the coordinated activities of literally millions of people from around the world. No one person can possibly begin to have in his or her head all the knowledge that's in a simple pencil. Takes too much. People have to know how to mine the ore in order to make the saw blades, and know how to use the saw blades, and find get the oil out of the ground in order to make the base for the paint, and find the dyes to color the paint, and find the bauxite to make the aluminum, to make the ferrule to hold the eraser onto the pencil. On and on and on and on. If a simple pencil is that complex, imagine really complex things like Toyota Camrys and the smartphones that we all have. Then imagine society itself. And so whenever you're proposing public policy, whenever you're analyzing public policy, you have to come to grips with the fact that the world is a lot more complex than it appears. It's a lot more complex than the words that we use to describe it. This is often forgotten in public policy discussions. It was thrown out of the window. It was defenestrated when COVID came along. The world's simple. We have a pathogen. What to do? Keep people inside. That'll make the pathogen go away. End of story. Pretty simple, pretty nonsensical, it seems. Second, and this is related to the first, beware of unintended consequences. We've all heard of unintended consequences. You know, good intentions are fine, but intentions are not results. I teach mostly 18-year-olds. I like teaching 18-year-olds because I'm kind of on their intellectual level. And so, but I tell them, intentions are not results. Just because someone has a good intention does not mean that that person's plan to make those intentions real will actually bring about the consequences that that person predicts. The world's full of unintended consequences, really bad unintended consequences. I was appalled over the past, I'm still mystified by it, that over the past 21 months, many economists who were very vocal in speaking out against things like minimum wage hikes and capital gains tax hikes and occupational licensing, tariff hikes, many of them didn't say anything about this intervention, this COVID intervention. Well, surely there are unintended consequences from shutting human society down. You think. I don't have the expertise to speak about whether or not the intended consequences would actually come about, suppression of COVID. I do have the expertise to say that when you shut society down, you're going to get a lot of unintended consequences, and they're not going to be good because human society is far more complex than the people who shut it down seems to think it is. The analogy that I've often used, I'm not sure it's perfect, no analogy is, but you can think of society as a jet plane, right? So the plane's cruising along in the sky. It's not perfect. You can run into a little turbulence, but the jet's going along. But you can't just say, let's shut the plane down for a while. Now, if you do that, the plane's going to plummet. And then people think, well, no problem, until it hits the ground. We can always restart the engine. I know nothing about aviation, but I suspect that you would not want to be in a jetliner whose engine turns off and be much reassured by the pilot who says, no, not to worry, we're going to turn the engine back on before we hit the ground. Phew, okay, I thought you were leading us into some real horror. Also related is a principle called, it's an acronym. It's one of my favorite acronyms, TANSTOFL. There ain't no such thing as a free lunch. If you want to be grammatically correct, it's TINSTOFL. There is no such thing as a free lunch. And so I've made my own acronym, but I'm not very good at acronyms. It's TANSTAFPFC. There ain't no such thing as free protection from COVID. You can't pronounce that like TANSTOFL. But people, astonishingly to me, at least among my fellow economists, they seem to they ignored the cost side of COVID mitigation measures. Or they at least treated those costs by assumption as being of such insignificance that we can ignore them. Good economics, at the very least, says when you're analyzing public policy, you do a cost-benefits analysis. You don't just do a benefits analysis. If you just look at the benefits of some policy, well, it's always going to win, assuming that benefits are even as much as minuscule. You have to look at the costs. And that, seems to me, was not done. The unintended consequences, the costs of COVID mitigation schemes and strategies was ignored. And a lot of people, it seems, continue to ignore those policies. A fifth, cost benefits one was the fourth, a fifth principle that we should keep in mind. I teach at George Mason University, and until, well, George Mason was put on the map economically, the economics department, by a man named James Buchanan. He won the Nobel Prize in economics in 1986, and he won it chiefly because he was a founder of a school of economics called public choice. And what that is the recognition, it's economics used to explain public policy using the same assumptions that economists make about human beings going about their private affairs. Seems pretty straightforward to me. People don't change their stripes. They don't become fundamentally different when they leave the boardroom and enter Congress or enter Parliament. So public choice scholarship says, look, human beings Politicians are human beings. They're mortal. They are no more angelically motivated than are any of the rest of us. They have no more access to knowledge than any of the rest of us have. And so when they clamor for power, be very cautious before giving it to them. Because they're not gods. They're not angels. They don't know. They probably don't know as much as they need to know in order to intervene successfully in the way that they want to intervene. None of these five, and there were more I could list, but I have only a limited amount of time. None of these five basic foundational principles of the economic approach to public policy was heeded to any great degree in the past 21 months. The world was treated as if it's a very simple place. Shut the thing down, turn the engine back on, we'll go back into the sky. The costs of COVID mitigation were largely ignored or treated as insignificant. Government officials were treated as noble angels sent to save us. Heaven forbid you think that these people have any motivation other than to save you, save us from the COVID monster. Again, let me be clear. I'm not saying that government officials are evil. I'm saying they're just like you and me. If my neighbor knocks on my door, and says, you know, I'm going to lock you inside for the next 3 months to protect you from you, or to protect others from you. And don't worry, my motivations are really, really good, right? I'm calling the police. But my neighbor is just like a politician, or a politician is just like a neighbor. And yet the press, I've never been one actually to criticize highly the media. I've become someone lately who criticizes highly the mainstream media. They've treated government officials in the past 21 months, the government officials they like. They treated them as if they are sages sent from heaven, sages sent from the top of Mount Olympus, with wonderful motivations, equipped with all the knowledge necessary to improve our lives. And of course, they're not. They're just ordinary human beings. And so I will just end with a lament. Jeffrey ended on a kind of a high note. We're going to eventually triumph. I hope he's right, but it's going to be a struggle, as he admits. But I just lament that so many of my fellow economists, not all, but so many of them, just seem to forget, almost as if a virus got into their brain and removed what they knew before. They forgot all of the things that were second nature to them until early 2020. Just threw it out the window and remained silent in the face of this horrible calamity that we've all experienced. Jay Bhattacharya and I think Miko, have a wonderful piece on the silence of economists in the face of COVID, and I endorse everything in that piece. And I gather in your writing it, you were rather surprised and appalled by it as well. It's mystifying, but we're here in this room together. There are people who have kept their heads about them. Certainly Jeffrey has, and Jeffrey's taken splendid action to keep the good, to keep the sensible people sensible and supported. So I applaud him. I thank you, Jeffrey, for having me at this event, and thank you all.
Thanks so much, Don. So we'll take about a 8 to 10 minute break.
Thank you, everybody. I've had this recurring daydream, you guys, and it's happened from almost the beginning of the pandemic. I've lost, I don't know how many friends. I've lost, I've been at Stanford for 35 years, and I think 5 people still talk to me. I don't know, 7. This could be. But what's happened through this pandemic is I've gotten to know so many of you, and the recurring daydream was this, that we would meet together and just celebrate finding each other. Let me tell you why it's so fitting. Because what is a lockdown? A lockdown is a policy designed to keep each of us apart from one another. And by any measure, this event shows that they've failed. They have failed. They cannot keep us apart. The human spirit will not abide a lockdown. We are not in a place where we're not rats in cages where you can defeat a disease by keeping us apart. And what Don said earlier is exactly right. The harms of the lockdown are familiar. I'm going to spend not so much time about this because this is one of my favorite topics. I've said this over and over, and I'm sure you all have heard. But I just want to talk about a little bit, just so I can set up, because what I want to spend most of my time on is on the Reformation, what has to come next. And but let's talk about let's just so we can come to terms with what's happened. The harms of the lockdown are first psychological. Right? 1 in 4 young adults last year seriously considered suicide in the United States. They're medical. People skipped cancer treatments. Women are arriving this year with stage 4 breast cancer that should have been picked up last year and will die from it. They are social. They are artistic. They are cut across every single aspect of society. And in the developed world, we faced an enormous harm from them. But the harm to the poor in the developing world is even greater. 100 million people thrown into poverty overnight. Right? We created a global system of trade, 30, 40 years of globalization countries, where we said, restructure your economy, fit into the global economy, and people will be lifted out of poverty. And it worked. 1 billion people lifted out of poverty. But when you change that overnight, 100 billion people are thrown into poverty. We broke our promises. We threw 80 million people into the brink of starvation. Hundreds of thousands of children dead from starvation in South Asia alone. The consequence of these lockdowns, when we went into them, we should have seen, because the world is complicated, because it is interconnected, and yet we pretended as if it were the only thing we could do, the only possible way to address this pandemic, the only reasonable thing to do to keep us apart. And now we face a choice, right? And you can see the stark choice in the United States in red and blue. In some states, the lockdowns are gone. You have life. It's not 2019 life. It can never be 2019 life. But it's life where people go to school, kids go to school. It's places where people go to church and they go to their synagogues. They go to they can go to their bars. They can go to restaurants. They don't feel harangued. They don't feel this sense that someone's watching them. And on the other hand, you have a biosecurity state, a state that's focused with one goal, which is the control of a single infectious disease. Right? It's like war. When you are at war, you are willing to sacrifice everything for the purpose of winning. Well, that's what we've done. We've reorganized our societies around this one goal. The lockdown, the keeping people apart. Well, what does that state look like? Well, that state is the state that many of us have lived in through the epidemic. It's a state of anxiety. It's a state of worrying what your neighbor thinks of you. It's a state where you mask your very face. You don't send your children to school because that's not the priority. They can learn to read on Zoom, over and never meet their teacher. It's a state where you're worried if you gather more than 10 people in a room. It's a state where, and this actually happened in my county, where the government can tell people not to meet together even for a Bible study, right? Where it's a state where every single aspect of life is organized around the control of a single infectious disease, and actually doesn't do a very good job at that either, because 5 million people have died worldwide from it. Okay, all that's familiar. None of that is news to any of you. What I want to start, I was actually going to try to spend less time talking, but I want to talk about the Reformation, and I'll spend just a few minutes talking about that. And I'll start by talking about the Reformation of Science, because well, I don't know if you all have heard, but a preeminent authority at Harvard University declared last year that the age of enlightenment was over. He's sitting in the audience. Where is he? He's sitting right there, Martin Kulldorff. Declared, you know what? When I saw that, I thought he was exaggerating. A year later, I don't think he is. I think the age of enlightenment is over. Well, because what did the age of enlightenment depend on? The age of enlightenment depended on the ability of people to speak freely, to explore ideas freely, without fear that they're going to be canceled. In this room are many people who spoke freely and were canceled. Brave people. An age of enlightenment does not abide that. It doesn't allow that to happen. An age of enlightenment encourages dissension. Even when we're wrong, we help one another, because by being wrong, I've given you the opportunity to correct me, and I now have an opportunity to learn. Right? That's the basic ethos of the age of enlightenment. Well, that's done now, right? It's done because a small group of scientists, and I want to assure you, it's not the majority of scientists, even though what you may have heard. A small group of scientists have taken over the discourse. They control funding. They control what big tech says is true and false, and they've used that power to silence people who disagree. It shouldn't take bravery to have a scientific hypothesis, right? It may be brave to say something that's, oh, this is going to be right, and you're embarrassed because it turns out to be wrong. But that's a different kind of bravery. What's happened in science is not that there aren't brilliant scientists available, and there are still many. What's happened in science, and I hear this from countless junior people, is that the environment is such that if people say what they're actually thinking, they lose friendships, they lose grants, they lose opportunities for promotion, and they lose their ability to actually be an effective scientist. Well, that's reformable, right? Science depends on public support. Science depends on huge amounts of funding that come from the public itself, but it also depends on people believing and using the products of science. It depends on public trust, and that's been, because public trust has been shattered. That's the challenge science faces. So what does the Reformation look like? Well, the Reformation is just the restoration of the Enlightenment, right? It's the ability of scientists to speak up, be wrong, and learn from one another. It's the idea that a scientist can be canceled because they have an idea and they articulate the idea. It's so dangerous they can't even be said. Well, that itself, that idea needs to be canceled. Right? Okay. All right. Science. We fixed science. Let's fix public health. All right. How many people in the room have a high opinion of public health today? It's okay. You can raise your hand. Not seeing. I see a couple of hands. How many people had a high opinion of public health at the beginning of the epidemic? This is not this is a select sample of people. Oh my God, this is such a select sample of people. You guys are brave. But what you are seeing, the hands raised, is not atypical. The collapse of faith in public health is almost universal, and people in public health know it. And okay, so let me just say a word in favor of public health before I launch into it. Public health is important. I've spent my life doing public health. There's a lot of problems in public health that I spent my life criticizing. But what it does is incredibly important, because what is it supposed to do? It's supposed to provide tools to people, whoever you are, for how to live healthy. It is that while there are obviously elements in public health that are authoritarian in nature, that's not its primary function. It never has been. Right? It's not there to force you to not eat the Big Mac. It's not there to force you to quit smoking. It's there to tell you, well, here's what the consequences of smoking are. Here's some tools that will help you if you want to quit smoking. It's there to provide tools. It's there to translate science. It's there to support, but it's not truly there to force you to do things you don't want to do. Right? That's when public health is at its best. That's what it does. It's an empowering thing. And so, I've been trying to tell people this in public settings, and what's happened in this pandemic is that nobody believes me. Right? Because public health, and here's the criticism, it has not been empowering the last 20 months. Instead, what has happened, it's become a tool for authoritarian power, a tool for coercion, a tool for separating people. It's become a political tool that's been used to enforce the biosecurity state. And no public health built on that basis will ever earn trust. It may earn fear, but never trust. Now, I talked about science. I talked about what needs to happen in science. In science, you have to have this free exchange of ideas, this ability to be wrong. If I have a stupid idea, I should be able to express it and not worry about being canceled. I may have to worry about being proved wrong. God knows that's happened to me too many times to count. But what needs to happen in public health, it's a little bit different. If I get up and say, to take Don's analogy, let's turn the airplane off. It won't crash. I'm doing in public health, that would be a disservice. If I get up and tell you smoking is great for your health, I've actually committed a sin in public health, right? What I've done is I've taken science and I've falsified it, and I've betrayed the trust you may have in me as someone who does public health. I've told you a lie. And that has huge consequences. So in public health, the freedom of exchange of ideas is not actually a fundamental principle, right? In public health, there's this sort of I have this obligation to tell you true things, and I have to be a little bit careful about what those true things are. That's the coercion. That's where coercion comes from in public health, right? That's where canceling comes from in public health. If someone steps up and says smoking is good for you, public health authorities will rightly tell you that person is not to be believed, right? They'll cancel that person. There's some. I mean, as uncomfortable as I'm with it, there's some justification for that because that person is doing something irresponsible. But there's an ethical basis for that. The ethical basis is that there is an enormous literature, scientific consensus, truly, that smoking is bad for you. It causes lung cancer, it causes heart disease. There's an enormous sort of evidence base, an ethical base that justifies the suppression of that kind of speech. Now, I don't think that the person should be canceled, thrown out of polite society, but maybe they shouldn't no longer be public health advocates or public health authorities, right? That's the kind of canceling I mean. Well, in the context of COVID, you have a new virus, and it's new. We don't know the science behind it, and yet within a month, we went from, well, we're not sure what to do, to, my God, we better lock down, and anyone who opposes the lockdown is an evil monster that ought to be silenced. Right? The ethical basis for that norm in public health was thrown out. Well, how do you get that back? How do you get back public health? How do you restore public health? Well, you restore public health by making public health about what it's always been. It's about empowering people, or I should be clear, what it always should have been. It's about empowering people. It's about translating science honestly, and it's about being much more humble than it has been. I think the way you restore public health is by public health stepping down from this role it has as essentially the enforcers of the biosecurity state, in which it never will ever earn the trust of the people. Okay, you guys, we reformed science, public health. I got 2 more things and I'm done, I promise. Politics and law. Wait, that was one item. There's one more after that. Okay. How do we make this never happen again? Did you realize the kind of power that governors had before this? That they could close your schools, your kids' schools, at the snap of a finger? That they could force you to stay at home? At the beginning of the pandemic, I got permission, I had to ask for permission from Stanford to give me a letter to allow me to come to the office. It was a freaky experience. I was the only person there. I was actually scared to drive to work because I heard that people were stopping cars, that the cops were stopping cars to check the papers in the United States of America. So I started riding my bike up to school every day, lost 30 pounds. COVID's good for my health, it turns out. So anyways, that's... this kind of power requires many more checks and balances than exist now, obviously. Right? Normally, when you have the state with great power like this, in a democracy like the US, the fundamental principle is checks and balances. Right? Any democracy relies on that principle of checks and balances. I'm not a lawyer. I've now dabbled in politics for 20 months, and I really just want to get out. But the key thing to me seems to be this lack of check and balance. Who did they ask? Who did public health and the governors ask for permission to impose these powers? Governor Newsom in my state just extended the emergency order until March of 2022. Who checks him? Now, of course, you could say that the people, the clever people of California, just sort of failed to eject him from office by 2/3. So I guess we still have elections, but they're too infrequent. These kinds of powers are so extraordinary that they require some kind of check. And I think, to me, that's the political movement's needed, is a institutional structure that places brakes on the power of public health and the power of governors to enact these kinds of extraordinary policies. I don't know what that will look like, and I'll leave it to the folks in the room who are more familiar with law and politics. But to me, that's sort of the fundamental thing that's missing, that no one knew was missing before the pandemic. Okay, last, and this, I don't know if it needs reform, other than just needs lighting up, because I think really this is the key to the end of the pandemic and to the Reformation itself. The last thing is art and culture. The pandemic ends when the culture changes with it. The pandemic, the society reforms when culture turns against what we've just seen. And now I'm really out of my depths. Art, oh my God, you guys should see my art. My son who's here, he's laughing because he knows what my art looks like. It doesn't look good. I do these stick figure things. You guys will be, well, I won't show it off. Unless, Hunter Biden can sell these things for a lot of money. I don't know why I can't. Okay, the most hopeful signs I've seen have been musicians starting to write songs, protest songs about the pandemic. I've seen people write beautiful, moving stories. Some of you in the room have written stories that have just utterly shattered me. We need to come to terms with what's happened. It's a great trauma. what's happened with the lockdowns. And the only way really as a society to come to terms with it is art, is writing, is music, is culture. That needs to start to change. And I think we're seeing signs of that already. Because that's what cements the Reformation. And I know I won't play a role in that other than to consume it, but I'm really looking forward to that consuming of it. So I have one more daydream to share with you guys. The Reformation's going to happen. It's coming. Can you sense it? And when it happens, I want us to be together. I've been having this recurrent daydream, and we're going to come back again. And the next time we meet, we won't lament the lockdown. We'll celebrate the Reformation. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Jay. And now I'd like to introduce Martin Kulldorff. You know him. He's an architect of the Great Barrington Declaration and also equally famous and loved all over the world, this man. Mostly. We love Martin. Martin is also, if you didn't see the announcement, he is the Senior Director of Science for the Brownstone Institute. Martin Kulldorff.
Thank you, Jeffrey, and thank you everybody for being here, for coming here. So great to see so many of you, some of who I know from, I've seen pictures of you, you've been writing things or tweeting things, so it's sort of nice to see so many of you here. I don't know if you're scared of COVID, but I was really scared of COVID for about 20 minutes. I heard about the Wuhan thing, but then the first two areas outside of China that was affected was Italy, northern Italy, and Iran. And at that point, it was absolutely clear to me, knowing how diseases spread, that this would be a worldwide pandemic and it will be reaching every country in the world, sooner or later. So that was a concern. And as a parent, my biggest concern is always about my kids. So I looked up the data from Wuhan. That was the only data that was available at the time. And they had a list of the age of those who have died from COVID. And they were mostly old people. And it was clear everybody was at that time living a normal life in Wuhan, so everybody would be about equally exposed. Maybe old people are a little bit less exposed than working age people and so on, but there's not a huge difference, at most a twofold difference risk. So since there were so many old people dying and very few younger people dying, it was clear that this was a disease that affected the old, but not the young. So my children were safe, and I figured, okay, they can live a normal life. We have to protect older people so that they don't get this disease, but kids and younger adults can live a normal life. And I figured, okay, good. And then they started with lockdowns. They closed down everything for everybody. They closed down the schools. Didn't make any sense at all from an epidemiological perspective. And I worked 20 years with disease outbreaks, and I was stunned. Why would they do that? So I decided, well, I have to sort of make this clear, because people didn't seem to realize that this was an age-dependent thing, and we had to do, we had to deal with it using that utility. If you have an enemy, and in this case the virus was the enemy, you have to utilize the weakness of the enemy. The weakness of this virus was it doesn't affect young people very much. So we have to utilize that fact in our battle against this virus. But so I tried to write something about it, and I wrote something, I sent it to various venues here in the US, but none of them wanted to hear from me. I guess the fact that I had 20 years of experience with disease outbreak doesn't really matter. And I guess the university I was working on wasn't prestigious enough or something like that. I'm not quite sure. But I could not get it published. So I obviously realized that there was something wrong and that's with how the public health and science operated. I'm a native of Sweden, and I was sort of retained my sanity. I was reading the Swedish newspapers. But then I got afraid because I figured, well, if Sweden was the only country who was sort of holding up sanity here, and if they buckled, then there was no control group. So I wrote some op-eds in the major daily newspapers in Sweden. I had no problems getting it published there. So I had 3 op-eds there. And my thought was, well, if Sweden can hold out until the summer, with the schools open and so, then everybody will realize that that was the right approach. And then come next school year, everybody will do what Sweden did. Boy, was I wrong. So, but anyhow, in the summer, I figured Sweden has kept the schools open for all the kids, daycare and schools from age 1 to 15. And there are 1.8 million children in this age group during this first wave. How many of them do you think died from COVID? Yeah, 0. But there was an article in New England Journal of Medicine about should schools be open or not. And they referred to a number of studies, but they didn't mention anything about the one major Western country who had kept the schools open throughout this. There was no mention of what happened in Sweden. So that's like doing a clinical trials and not having a control group. Ignore the data from the control group. So I figured, okay, I should try to get this information out there because there was a study from the Swedish Public Health Agency which had shown these results, and also that teachers were not at any increased risk compared to others. So I tried to sort of get that out there. I started to tweet, and actually I managed even to get an op-ed into the CNN, CNN Español. The English version of CNN did not want it. So, but eventually we moved forward and we wrote the Great Barrington Declaration. And I think when we had 3 of us who all had worked with infectious disease epidemiology, and Sujata Gupta was not here, in my mind she's the premier infectious disease epidemiologist in the world. So the fact that we could get together and say that this was a bad approach, then it became hard to convince people that there was, people realized then that there was no scientific consensus about this misguided approach to the pandemic. I think we are in a crisis when it comes to science and when it comes to public health, because public health has not done the work that needed to be done. There are many examples of that. For example, if you have a pandemic, you need to know how many people, you have to monitor, you have to do surveillance to monitor how it develops. So you need to know what's the infection rate over time in different geographical area and different places. So Jay wrote an op-ed in Wall Street Journal about the need for that because it wasn't being done. And eventually, since nobody was doing it, he did it. He did the Santa Clara study, which was a very important study in the US, to find out how many had actually been infected. But that's something that CNN should have done throughout this pandemic regularly, doing random surveys, test people, are you infected now? Do you have antibodies? Is it different in Texas versus Montana? How does it vary by age group? Is it more in the older or more in the younger? Some other countries did those kind of surveys. Spain, for example, did one. But CDC here completely failed that aspect. Also, we know how many people have been reported to be dead from COVID, but how many of them did actually die from COVID? And that should be an easy thing to do if you're a CDC. You take a random survey of those being reported. There's so few children, so the children you can take everybody, but for the older you do a random and then see is it How many actually died because of COVID? How many died where COVID maybe was a contributing factor? They really had something else, but sort of COVID helped tip them over the edge. And how many died for completely different reasons? CDC hasn't done those things. That needs to be done. Another thing which I was involved in a little bit was when you have a vaccine, you have to monitor the safety of the vaccine. And in the pandemic, that has to be done very rapidly. And there's been some good work on that, but in general, we should know at this point much more about the adverse reaction to the vaccines than we do. So that's another failure of CDC. So we really have to build up public health from scratch, basically, because it has failed us. And I think science has also failed us. Not so much individual scientists, because there are many good scientists at CDC. I know many of them personally. But the scientific leadership and the structure of science and the structure of public health has to be reformed. And I think to do that, we can't just work within the existing institutions, because they are the one who failed us, the leadership there. So we have to build up the new institutions, the new organizations to do that. And that's a lot of work, but it's something that we have to do, and we have to try the best to do as best we can. And I think that's a role of Brownstone to help with that, to be one of those institutions, one of those organizations to build that up. And as Jeffrey was saying, at this point, there are many scientists who understand this. I get many emails privately and saying, thank you for what you're doing, you're right, and so on. But there is a fear of speaking up, and there's a loneliness. I was very lonely in the spring of 2020 because I didn't know all of you guys who were here. So it felt very lonely. So I think to have Brownstone to create a community, both of scientists as well as of other people who are interested in this. And one amazing thing that I've seen actually is private citizens who have done public health and done studies and doing better public health studies than CDC and people in schools of public health. People, for example, in the group Rational Ground. So those are sort of amateur scientists who are actually doing better public health science than many public health scientists. So I think we have to incorporate that into building this safe refuge and community where we can make public health, restore public health. Right now there's little trust in public health, and that's actually a good thing because there shouldn't be any trust in public health right now. But we have to restore public health, and in that way also restore eventually the trust in public health. So thank you very much for coming here, and thank you for being part of Brownstone. I really appreciate it.
Okay, so we're going to invite Jay and Don and Martin up. I do need to get these chairs on the stage, so if you could help me with that, that would be great. Yeah, right. That's what happens when you have no staff. You're the staff. Okay, so just a reminder that the books outside are free, so long as they last, you know. It's part of my program to stimulate book sales. Just give them away for free. What else? Oh, you might have noticed that outside that door is a very important historical document. Did you see it? The original copy of the Great Barrington Declaration. I understand if you want to get a selfie in front of it. Totally understandable. It's a first-class relic. Okay, I've received no questions, so I'm going to ask. I'd like to first start with a question about, I mean, we've all been observers of all this, this disaster. I wonder if each of you could speak to perhaps your frustration with the media, And what you make of it, because I can't figure it out. One of the great frustrations I've had is that every time anybody talks about the costs of the lockdowns, they always describe it to the pandemic. Have you noticed that? They always say, oh, the pandemic caused kids to, whatever, some disaster, the pandemic caused children to lose 2 years of education. Oh, really? So, Don, maybe we'd start with you. Can you speak about that, the issue of, to what extent did the media coverage of this in the early days actually fuel the public panic that caused the politician to respond, or how do you see that role?
So, being an economist who's interested in public policy, all my adult life, I've been frustrated with the media. It's not very good at reporting on economic matters. I think it's even worse, however, on reporting about COVID. I'll give one example, but I think it is an example that is quite emblematic. It captures much of the way the media has approached this. There's this columnist for the Washington Post. She's a CNN contributor. She's a personality in CNN. She's got a medical degree. I think she's a pediatrician, but I'm not sure. Her name is Leanna Wen. And I read her in order to keep my high blood pressure medication producer in business. and a few months ago, she writes that it's a myth that COVID is not dangerous to children. It's a myth. It's being spread by some evil people. And so, she has a link to show that it's a myth. It's become the leading killer of children in the United States. So, wow, this is news to me. Let me click on this link. This is a link to a New York Times article, which says COVID has become the leading killer of children in the United States. So I click on in the New York Times link. It takes me to, I think it was a CDC site, and I counted where COVID was. It wasn't in the top 50. They had the 50 top rankings of things that kill. They had children, 0 to I think 7, and then 7 to 14. I forget the exact numbers. And you could look at actually, it was more convenient. It said the top 10 killers of people in America in these different age groups. COVID wasn't in there at all. And so this is inexplicable to me. The Washington Post was a prestigious newspaper. It has a columnist who repeats the stuff. The New York Times repeats it. I do not understand why these institutions do not get more pushback. This is just a blatant, I don't know if lie is the right word. Lie implies intention, but it's a blatant misrepresentation of the fact. It's easy to check. I checked it. It took me 5 minutes to check it. And I wrote a letter to the Washington Post thinking it would be published. Oh, look, here's nothing. They wouldn't publish the letter. Yeah,
so that's a question related to that. How do you account for the exclusion of contrary views from the dominant narrative from these same places? I mean, wouldn't they like the controversy? Wouldn't that get them clicks? Wouldn't that get them views? Why was it so sudden that they just organized around a single orthodoxy and to the exclusion of everything else?
I want to let these people are more intelligent than I am. I don't know. It's a huge looming mystery.
So I think that as a scientist, I could have some frustration with the media, especially in the beginning, because they were only interested in one perspective. But I think I talked to some journalists, and they had the similar frustration. So some of the medical journalists could not get their writing published because of the editors of the newspapers. So I have some sympathy for some of the brave journalists who actually have spoken up. And one example is a journalist named David Zweig, who did enormously good reporting on the school issue. Several very important articles from starting in the summer of 2020. And if you want to have a chat with him, you can find him in the back of the room there.
I also want to pay homage to a couple of instances where there really have been some attempts to. So I'll just give you a couple of examples. I was actually on CNN a couple of times, which actually amazes me now that I think about it. But it was because of one guy, this guy Michael Smerconish. He had me on a Saturday morning show at 6 a.m. It was I'm sure everyone's watched this, right? It was a discussion with John Barry, who wrote this fantastic book on the 1918 flu, and it was right after the Great Barrington Declaration, and the topic at the end of the discussion was about whether there should be how you can protect the vulnerable, and in particular how can you protect older people, and living in multi-generational homes. Right, this is a common question that comes up. In the Great Barrington Declaration, one of the ideas that we had was, well, you know, if you're living in a multi-generational home and you're older, and your grandma's living with grandson. Grandson comes home and says, you know, Grandma, I might have been exposed, or, you know, calls the parent. Well, public health in many places use hotel rooms for homeless people. Well, just offer that. The idea is offer that to the grandma. Then calls public health, says, oh, I'm not sure I can live at home safely. Can I use the hotel room? And then someone picks up grandma, brings her to the hotel room. 2 days later, after grandson's fine, you come home, right? That was the kind of idea. Just again, it's one of these things where, like, it's a small idea, but in some places it might work, and it's always going to be, focus protection is always going to be a local thing. Right? It's always going to be a personal thing. It's never going to be a fixed plan for everyone, because it depends on people's living circumstances. So I say this, John Barry, at the end of this man who I used to admire, at the end of this then says, why are you in favor of concentration camps for old people? Michael Smerconish then ends the show. So sorry, we don't have time for anything else. I mean, I just couldn't, I was absolutely flabbergasted. I mean, I don't think this is for clicks. I think a lot of this is a lot of the media, like the CNNs, I think they honestly think they're doing good. I think they think that they are suppressing people who are peddling dangerous misinformation in the same way that someone who says smoking is good for you would. But that means that they're misinformed about the science in a deep way. They don't even understand what science is. I haven't been part of the media. I mean, first time I was ever on TV was 20 months ago. So I don't know for long enough. I don't have enough experience to see that. But it seems like a lot of the scientists who inform the media are just. I mean, it's the same kind of it's the same kind of corruption that Martin was talking about inside science itself, right? A small group of people who have particular interests, and they use the media to talk about the narrative in a big way, in a sort of very slanted way. And I mean, I think to fix it, you just need competition. Right, so like Jan Jelik, who did a fantastic interview. I'm sorry, I butchered your name. I apologize. If it's any consolation, people butcher my name all the time. Not you, but I mean, like Epoch Times. I've been able to go on Fox News. I've been able to go on other media that appear to be on the periphery, but in many ways, people who pay attention to that have had better information about the pandemic than people who pay attention to the center. How do you combat the fact that CNN is this essentially has been this engine of misinformation, and so many people pay attention to it? I don't know. I mean, I think is it true that people still pay attention to CNN science coverage? It seems like people are starting to understand that there's something wrong there, right? That the science coverage that you're getting from the mainstream. I mean. In the Soviet Union, people used to pass around, because there was the media environment in the Soviet Union was even more oppressive, right? And so people would pass around quietly little pieces of samizdat, they were called, little, just essentially like papers that people wrote that were not ever going to be trumpeted in Pravda. You know, the Great Barrington Declaration is like that. It's Samizdat. You guys heard about it not on CNN, I'm sure, because if they covered it, it was covered as concentration camps for old people. So it's going to have to be something like that. Some sort of alternate structure. It already exists that becomes the center as people start to distrust what's been told of them.
You know, it seemed to me, maybe this is covered in Berentz's book, but I remember from mid-February, it wasn't always that bad. I remember there was a headline in Psychology Today that said, your doctor is not worried about the coronavirus, you shouldn't be either, right? Salon was running articles debunking apocalyptic visions of the future of the pandemic. This is mid-February. Do you remember this? It was like there's a sense of reasonableness in the air. And all that changed dramatically. I'm not sure when precisely, but it seemed to be around, about, March, the first week of March. And it shifted. And for what reason? Does anybody want to comment on that?
I can tell you like one small anecdote. When I wrote the Santa Clara study, I got invited on CNN by Sanjay Gupta. But this is when I knew nothing about media. His people wrote to me, said, we're willing to talk about the Santa Clara study, but you have to offer it up as an exclusive. And I thought, this is science. I don't think science should be exclusive to one media organization. So I said no, and then he didn't invite me on. So I think it's like, I don't think it's just, I think there was like normal kinds of like things going on in the background, but then it was also like this sort of very weird, if something is not maximally panicky, then it's just, then therefore it's dangerous. That took hold in March, right after those things, and it's continued to this day.
I sort of blame the New York Times, actually. They seem to be ahead of everybody. All the journalists want to go to work for the New York Times. When the New York Times started spreading panic, that was another way of telling the journalistic community and the media, but this is the way we're going. Let me just read some of these questions. They're all so powerful, and now we've got a huge stack of them. How much of the problem with public health have to do with elected officials deferring too much to the public health officials who may have a bias toward preventing the direct health issue and against other direct costs?
All right, I'll go. I don't want to dominate. These guys know more than me. So the politicians I've interacted with, they, with a couple of exceptions, which you can probably guess, they don't know much science. And it's not wrong. I mean, it's like that's not part of their sort of. I guess when you go to politician school, you don't go study science is the thing, right? So, and so they reasonably look to other people. So what they want is some risk-free way of getting out of the jam they're in. And so if they point to, well, I just asked Dr. Fauci here, and he told me I need to lock down. Oh wait, sorry, Martin. I didn't mean to insult you. I mean, it's so easy. I'm just doing what you told me, and if it goes wrong, well, I took the best advice. And I think that dynamic has underplayed almost every single politician's decision making. Ignorance and risk aversion combined to create this mess.
I think the politicians in the beginning of the pandemic, I can understand that they were not so well versed in infectious disease epidemiology. But this pandemic has been the most important political issue for almost 2 years now. So if you're a politician, I think it's your responsibility to read up on infectious diseases and to do it with different perspectives. So that you don't only listen to Dr. Fauci, but look at different people, a different perspective, different opinions about it. So I think most politicians failed with that. They just sort of blindly followed the herd. instead of taking the responsibility of doing some research and learning about it and listening to different people. And there are some exceptions to that rule, but for most part, I think politicians didn't do that, and that's what their responsibility to do.
This is a very interesting question here. Has the internet technology been an enabler of lockdown policy? In other words, no Zoom, no Netflix, they can't have lockdown. And I'll just add to this sort of an interesting aspect here. In 2006, there was this thing called avian bird flu. You remember that? And George Bush was running around giving press conferences about how it's going to be the worst thing that's ever happened, and we're going to have to lock down. And there was a lockdown plan that was already in place. You can read it, issued by the Bush, and they were telling people to stay home from work. Well, back in those days, 15 years ago, not that many people could just leave their offices. And so, well, the real reason we didn't lock down in 2006 was that the avian bird flu turned out to only being caught by birds, actually. And they really left the birds and went to humans, so that's one factor. But it's true, 15 years ago, you couldn't have had all these people hanging around at home. And I remember, Carter Meacher, does anybody recognize the name Carter Meacher? Yeah. So this guy, I mean, you haven't heard much about him ever since, really, but he, if you read Michael Lewis's book called, I don't remember, Carter Meacher emerges as the great hero. And God forbid this book is ever made into a movie, because it's going to be really bad. Carter Meacher is the main guy who was a consultant for the Veterans Administration, who whipped up everybody into a frenzy, and was mainly, I would say, bore the main responsibility for the lockdowns of the schools, for the schools closures. He was frenzied. He was just screaming to public health officials all over the country, lock it down, close the schools. You won't regret it. If you leave them open, we're going to see death all over the place. And this guy was just a complete lunatic. And he says in his emails that were recovered through the Freedom of Information Act, he says something like, this is the so-called Red Dawn email list, right? He says something like, look, the kids, believe me, I know kids, they'd rather be posting on Instagram than be in school anyway. We'll just keep them busy with the technology, That's it. So, and I'm really interested in your comments about this, Don, because it makes people like us uncomfortable. I mean, I wrote a whole book celebrating, the glories of Facebook. I'm so embarrassed. Twitter is great. It's good. LinkedIn, God bless it, to on and on about the great technology. But what if these technologies actually did help enable politicians to imagine that you could lock down the economy, because they don't only think about themselves, right? It's true that a third of workers can work from home, but they don't care about the other 2/3. So much for the public interest. They don't. So they constructed these policies for themselves. But does it worry you, Don, about the possibility that our technological advances, which you celebrate and I celebrate, might have contributed to creating an imagined future that's actually a dystopian nightmare?
Yes, I don't think it can be denied. And I'll go even further than that. I was an optimist until March of 2020. I'm no longer much of an optimist. The economists have the theory for the role of government. And the theory goes like this. Well, the market can do some things, but the market often fails. And when the market fails, that's when government comes in to correct the market failures. Right? It's a nice theory. You can draw it on the blackboard, whiteboard, looks good. I have a different theory. I think a government grows not because the market fails. I think the government grows because the market works so well and so quietly. We become so wealthy, we take it for granted. It looks as if wealth just creates itself. It just happens. We don't see its creation. When you don't see its creation, then so you don't understand what's causing it. And so when people, I think, become more open to these wacky solutions like lockdowns, if wealth is automatic, if it just happens, well, okay, you can stay in your house and not do anything because the wealth is out there. It's going to happen anyway. And so I believe that I'm glad we're a wealthy society, but every benefit has a cost. And one of the costs of our great wealth is that it has allowed us this folly. A really poor society could not have afforded this folly. We did, and well, maybe afford is not the right word.
Can I add to that, Don? I mean, I think there's a concrete technology, which Zoom actually, and you mentioned this, Jeffrey, is that I think Zoom, without Zoom, we wouldn't have had a lockdown. The 30% of jobs that could be preserved and done on Zoom were essentially the wealthy, right? That we call them the laptop class. In 2009, when H1N1 happened, that technology didn't exist. The 30% of jobs didn't exist. The class of people that essentially benefited from the lockdown are the ones that did not lose their jobs because of Zoom. And Don, actually, the thing is, poor countries copied us and suffered for it. You know, there it's not 30% of jobs, it's 5% of jobs. And the 95% suffered.
I've got a question here. What city, states, or countries had the least COVID policies, mitigation measures? And I think the answer to that is probably Sweden and Belarus, as far as I understand. And then also in this country, it would be South Dakota did almost nothing, right? Am I missing anything? Is that it? I mean, I have friends of mine who, they've been worried about the coming disaster in the United States, so they moved to places like St. Kitts. Well, guess what? St. Kitts locked down. They couldn't even get out. So, there was no safe place for anyone, very few, anywhere in the world. Are we missing anybody besides South Dakota, Sweden, and Belarus?
I'm kind of fond of Florida myself, you guys.
But they locked down for a long time.
Well, they opened in May, started in May, and then fully opened in September. I mean, Nebraska was lighter. I mean, you all can. I can tell you, everything looks like it was open compared to California to me. So there's that going on. I mean,
But there's two sides to it, because one thing is the importance of keeping things open for children and most of society. But the other thing is the utter failure to protect older, high-risk people, that the general lockdowns didn't protect it. The beliefs were that they would, but they didn't. So there was an enormous failure to protect older, high-risk people with what would have been a sort of standard measures. So that's sort of the other side to the coin, that those failures were fairly universal. And I think some countries did better, like I think Norway did a better job with protecting older, high-risk people. So there's two parts to it, I think.
I've got so many questions. So we are going to have a question and answer period. So if we don't get to this, then that's fine. But wow, I was going to ask another question, but instead I'll just read this. What do we do about the fact that the CDC is treated like God? The CDC guidance rules every politician and private businesses point to the CDC when enacting the rules, and it is strange. I mean, I think we all knew there was a CDC. I mean, CDC looms a lot larger in your heads than it ever did in mine, I always thought of the CDC as some annoying agency that, told you to eat a lot of bread when they probably shouldn't have, this kind of thing. I didn't think that much about it. How did it obtain this godlike status, and what do we do about it? Any takers?
I think CDC has failed us during this pandemic. It is the role of CDC to make recommendations and guidelines. The problem is that, as I said before, CDC hasn't gathered the information that's necessary, but also the guidelines have been very misguided in many cases. For example, closing schools. The former CDC director Redfield said that masks are more effective than vaccines, which is complete nonsense. And I guess the current CDC director, Walensky, she's slightly better because she only claimed 80% efficacy of the masks. I mean, the truth is that there's been only 2 randomized trials of masks with for COVID. One was in Denmark, which showed that they might be slightly beneficial or they might do slightly harm. We don't really know. The confidence interval sort of crossed 0. And then there was another study from Bangladesh where they randomized villagers to masked or no masks. And the efficacy of the mask was a reduction of COVID with something between 0 and 18%. So either no effect or very minuscule effect. And we will never approve a drug or a vaccine if with an 18% reduction. We need better than that. So I think CDC has failed both in the data gathering activities, which is their responsibility, and it is their responsibility to make guidelines and recommendations, but they have failed there too, unfortunately.
Can I try it with a slightly different angle on this? I think when we're faced with danger, parts of our brain take over that we're not necessarily proud of, but that are there nonetheless. It's a very human thing to seek experts, to seek guidance when we face a danger that we can't control. And it's inevitable. I mean, we were going to look to somebody, and the CDC is the agency that's responsible for pandemics. They're responsible for infectious disease outbreaks. They study them. I don't know if you all have played board games, but I'm deeply addicted to board games. There's a game called Pandemic. I don't know if anyone's played Pandemic. I've not played it during the actual pandemic because I can't make myself do it. But it features as its central player the CDC. A hyper-competent CDC where you send people around the world and they're managing things, they're discovering things.
Can they actually achieve anything? Or
you can solve the pandemic,
okay.
the 4 pandemics all at once at the end of it.
I think off of that movie Contagion, where they have CDC. Have you seen this one? And what's strange about that movie is that CDC doesn't actually achieve anything in the movie. They're running around at press conferences and marching through halls and yelling at each other. They don't actually do anything.
But we want that. And it is natural to want that, right? In fact, but what's the obligation? I mean, Martin's made a case that they failed in their obligation. If they didn't know how to do it, they could have just said, look, there are all these uncertainties. That's the honest thing that they should have done. Here are all these uncertainties.
So put yourself in the position of a top-level government official like Anthony Fauci. One thing he could have said, you said it would be the more honest thing, well, we don't know enough, so our policies do nothing. Right? Yeah. So people would have died, and then inevitably he would have been blamed for not solving the problem. Mm-hmm. So he has an incentive to do something. And so even though people still die, he can always say, as people are saying still, but thankfully he did something, because if he didn't do anything, the number of fatalities would have been much higher. So there's an inherent bias to do something,
right?
And not well, the inherent bias to do something.
You know, the weird thing is there was things to do, right? So here's the secret of the Great Barrington Declaration. That document out there, it actually we wrote it in October 2020. It's not new. It's 100 years old, right? The pandemic plans of 100 years involve identifying the vulnerable, protecting them, and disrupting society as little as possible, not panicking anybody. That's what they could have done. They could have said that, and yet for some reason that wasn't enough.
So this really gets us to, let's go to a dark place, how about? It really gets us to the question of why, and you've been asked this and I've been asked this. People always ask me, why did this happen? I never have a good answer for it. For me, it's some combination of a perfect storm, maybe politics, media, technology. There's a lot of factors here. But it's hard to neglect 2 things that people want to talk about a lot. One is the Gates Foundation. And there's no question that Bill Gates is, I should say, slightly confused about matters of cell biology. He seems to think that viruses and human persons operate exactly like viruses in the hard drive. So the key to there is just always block them, crush them, get your antivirus software, which is vaccines and so on. And gosh, I mean, the Gates Foundation gave away billions, and we all know this, to universities, research centers, epidemiologists, scientists, and so on. So And maybe it sounds crazy, like, well, how could some computer nerd, corrupt the whole of public health all over the world? I don't know. Money talks, and when rich people are flinging money around, it tends to speak. So there's that. And then the other thing that people talk about a lot is the role of big pharma, which obviously had a very tremendous financial incentive very early on. Once Operation Warp Speed came along and Trump said, oh, I've got billions of dollars to hand out to the first person that comes up with a really good vaccine, and suddenly out of nowhere, we've got vaccines that are 95% effective. Oh, very interesting. But so there's that element too. I wonder how you could size up, and if you don't want to speak about Gates Foundation and Big Pharma, and there's some other topic you want to talk about, that gets to this question of why did this happen? It didn't happen in 68, 69. It didn't happen in 2009. It didn't happen in 2012, at least not here. It didn't happen in 57, 58. It didn't happen in 29. It didn't really happen that much in 1918. So why 2020? And what are the powers that really caused us to pursue unprecedented experiment in disease mitigation?
You're right. I'm sure we've all been asked that question countless times, and I have no answer. I mean, I think one of the specific contributing factors, it doesn't answer the whole question, is you remember that picture that came out of Wuhan back in early 2020? You had people lying dead on the street holding shopping bags with people in hazmat suits standing over them. So this is spread throughout the rest of the world.
They're all fake, right? I just read this. They're all fake.
This is COVID. I'm in Target 1 minute, next minute I'm dead. I want to be. That's a really frightening image. So that's clear. That picture had to be clearly fake. But that kind of scaremongering was spread very quickly by the mainstream media.
I think public fear is the decisive thing.
It doesn't answer why in 2020 not, because we had we had mainstream media in 2012. It's a good question.
Go. I mean, I kind of I'm immune to we're very resistant to conspiracy theories, and so I'm going to try to do a non-conspiracy theory. So I think it's that there's panic. There's built the origins of the virus. I don't know the answer. But I think we may learn over time, so that we can change. But let's take all that as given, and then you have all these interests. They're not colluding with one another, but they all have an interest, right? So we have a mRNA technology that we can repurpose for this. We have, Gilead has a remdesivir that we can use to deal with this. We have, you have a group with a fantastic model that we used in H1N1. We got it wrong by an order of magnitude, but we can reuse for this. And all of that comes together with their own interests, and you have politicians that are looking for an answer. I think that's the pathology that led to this. It wasn't one person it's not a James Bond movie, The Mastermind. I think it's what it is like individual people, all with their own self-interest, many of whom found this opportunity and used it. To really bad effect.
I think that's right.
All right, let's talk about mass vaccinations, because that is obviously, when the vaccines came along, it was very exciting, because it seemed like it held out a possibility of an end to the lockdowns. But I don't even think at that time, you tell me, did you ever imagine that there would be a vaccine mandates? I mean, Fauci denied we'd ever do this thing, right? But how do you account? How do you account for this? I think you disagree with the policy, but how do you account for the existence of this policy, which the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals yesterday just denounced? You should read this ruling. The thing is so great. It's like it could have been written by anybody in this room. I mean, it's really satisfying to read a court saying something normal, something real, and actually talking about human liberty. It's just an amazing thing. I forget now. Oh, mass vaccinations. Like, what do you make of that?
So I think a lot of strange and crazy stuff has gone on this 2 years, but the one that takes the prize, I think, is the denial of immunity of having had COVID for COVID recovered people, and forcing vaccines on them, because we have known since at least 430 BC, during the Athenian plague, that if you have recovered from a disease like this, then you have immunity. So they used recovered people to care for the sick. And suddenly in 2020, we forgot that. And to me, as a scientist, that's stunning. You would expect that when you have a vaccine, it's not quite as good immunity as having had the disease. That's what you expect. Of course, when the vaccines came, we didn't know that, but now we know from, for example, a study in Israel, that the vaccinated are 27 times more likely to have symptomatic disease than those who have recovered from natural immunity. And so natural immunity is better. So this denial is very surprising, and I think it's also bad for public health for two reasons. One is people know about this. So when then CDC says that everybody should get vaccinated even if you had COVID, they know that that doesn't make any sense because they're already protected. Maybe they get more protection from the vaccine. We don't know that yet from the studies. That might be the case, but that means that you already have a very small risk, and then you maybe make that small risk even lower. So in terms of mandating, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to fire nurses who worked throughout the year on the COVID wards. They got infected, they were homesick, they got recovered, now they have immunity, and their immunity is actually better than those who are vaccinated. But now they're being fired by administrators who are working from home and who then got vaccination, which is not as good. So instead, the hospital should hire nurses with natural immunity and use them for those places where the population is more sensitive, the geriatric wards. Because even if an old person, let's say they are 85 years old, they're frail, they have to go to the hospital, even if they are vaccinated, they could die from COVID. So we don't want to expose them to it, especially not when they're sick in the hospital. So the best people to use to care for them are nurses with natural immunity. But instead of using them for that to protect their patients, the hospitals are firing them. It's unbelievable, I think.
The only way I can make sense of the vaccine mandates is to recognize that the official COVID narrative has become a fundamentalist religion, and the vaccine is the sacrament. And if you have to prove your devotion to the religion by taking the sacrament, and if you don't, you will be ostracized. I think that's what it's become.
The Eucharist, it's very interesting. I think I'm using a little more than the time that I was allowed here, but I have two final things I just want to mention. Then we're going to open it up for everybody. So I've neglected a lot of questions, but the first one concerns the narrative of the future about the actual severity of COVID-19. We know where it's going. People want to compare it to 1918, and continue to deny the huge demographic differences and risk, or deny things like one of the questions pointed out that the number of comorbidities the number of people had with COVID. So can you speculate now with me, once all the data are in, and once all the dust settles, and let's just say it's 10 years from now, and we're looking at things realistically. What would you say, how would you rank the severity of COVID-19 as a virus, or are you willing to do that? Is it 1968? Is it 57, 58? Is it less? Is it 2012? Or is it 1918? Or is it the Black Death?
Not quite as bad as the Black Death. It's a nasty bug, yeah. So that's very clear. I think it's a huge relief that children are not affected much. And that's the difference from the 1918, where a lot of young people died. So in that sense, we should be very lucky about this pandemic, that it was not hard hitting on children and young adults. Yeah.
So on the question of like for and with, I'm sorry, by or of, sorry, preposition confusion, of and with, do you think that that choice of, you died of COVID or just with COVID, do you think that's going to impact the data, and to what extent? Do you have a sense of that yet?
I mean, there was a study done in Alameda County in California and also Santa Clara County where they actually did a death certificate audit, and 1 in 4 of the people that were marked as dying from COVID were found to have only incidentally had COVID when they died. So 25%. I don't know if that's typical, and it is. I absolutely agree with Martin. It is a scandal that we haven't done this already, right? It's one of these things that's like a fundamental question we should have an answer to, and there's no reason we don't. It's just for not, lack of looking, we will look. I mean, it's not like that is, deaths are recorded in probably the most detail of any health statistic out there. So it's not like the answer will be hidden forever. It's just, it will come out. The issue is, why has it been hidden for so long? It's a failure of the CDC.
Okay, we're about to end the public section of this, and there's so many questions, so we're going to have some Q&A after this. But let me just end by asking each of you to maybe name the one thing that frustrates you most about the public narrative concerning this pandemic, the thing that you just get so tired of people refusing to talk about. I get asked this question all the time. What's the worst effect of lockdowns? It's a hard question. What are the things that frustrate you the most? I guess my answer, we all have to point to the closure of the schools, which is just astonishing. But I'm also there's other things that go on, like the fact that loved ones in hospital, people in the hospital are not allowed to have their loved ones around them under extreme conditions where having friends and family around you can actually improve your health. It's not allowed, even now. If you go to the hospital for any reason, you're not going to allow anybody to have anything. To me, that's a scandal. So what, for each of you, is the most sort of devastating effects of lockdowns, the thing least talked about that should be talked about more?
So for me, the most frustrating thing is that there's been unilateral focus on COVID, and that goes against a foundational principle of public health. Public health is about all diseases. It's not just about COVID, it's about other diseases, infectious diseases, about cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, about mental health. And closing schools is also about the physical and mental health of children. So ignoring all the collateral damage to public health, to me, has been the most frustrating as a public health scientist, that we only care about this one disease and we let everything else go to the drains.
For me, it's this binary alternative between lockdown and let it rip, right? As if there's nothing you can do other than lockdown or let it rip, right? And if you're against lockdown, you're an irresponsible monster that's in favor of letting disease go through society. That is such a false idea. There are enormous things that are possible to do to protect the vulnerable that we didn't do because we thought that lockdowns were the only way we could protect the vulnerable. And instead, as a result, we exposed countless people to the virus that should have been protected because we didn't adopt the policies that would have protected them. In fact, if you listen to some of the top public health people in the country, what they'll tell you is, trying to protect the vulnerable is impossible. The dean of the Brown School of Public Health just the other day wrote that it was impossible. That he had some strange analogy about peeing in the pool, which I don't fully understand. I think there's one of these things where, like, if you don't believe that it's possible to protect the vulnerable, you know what's going to happen? You're not going to be able to protect the vulnerable. I mean, and anyone who says that has essentially committed dereliction of duty, right? The conversation from the very beginning should have been who's vulnerable, how do we protect them, how do we keep society going in the meantime? That's the most frustrating thing. It has been from the beginning.
For me, it's what Martin said, the single-minded focus on this one disease. I'm going to get a little economics-y on you. One of the greatest events in economics occurred in 1871. It's called the Marginal Revolution. Every economist loves it because then we finally realize, to understand society, we understand that people make decisions at the margin. We choose a little bit more, a little bit less against all the costs and benefits of those decisions. But in this case, COVID has been elevated to be such an existential monster that we regard avoiding COVID as the only activity worth doing. I call it COVID derangement syndrome because if you focus on only one goal, no matter how good that goal is, if it were costless to pursue, you become deranged because you're ignoring all the costs of pursuing that goal.
I'd like to thank the viewers of the Epoch Times. You know, they've live streamed this for us, which is just glorious. We've had, I don't know, it seems like hundreds of thousands of viewers today, remarkably. So, and to talk about a great paper, I mean, they've been covering this stuff so well, and thank God for you. So, I've done a wonderful job, and so that will end the public portion of the program, and we'll go to private questions. I'd like to thank Donald Boudreaux, Jay Bhattacharya, Martin Kulldorff. Right? Thank you.